Sometimes my stomach hurts when I think about what will happen to her when I grow up and go away to start the rest of my life. Other times I imagine I'll never be able to leave it all. 24. All the friends I ever had are gone. On my 14th birthday, Bird woke me up by jumping on my bed and singing, "For she's a jolly good fellow." He gave me a melted Hershey's bar and a red woolen hat that he took from the lost and found. I picked a curly blonde hair off it and wore it around the rest of the day. My mother gave me an anorak attested by Tenzing Norgay, the Sherpa who climbed Mount Everest with Sir Edmund Hillary, and also an old leather pilot's hat like the kind worn by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who is a hero of mine. My father read me The Little Prince when I was 6 and told about how Saint X was a great pilot who risked his life to open mail routes to remote places. In the end, he was shot down by a German fighter, and he and his plane were lost forever in the Mediterranean Sea. Along with the jacket and the pilot's hat, my mother also gave me a book by someone named Daniel Elridge, who she said would deserve a Nobel if they gave them to paleontologists. "Is he dead?" I asked. "Why do you ask?" "No reason," I said. Bird asked what a paleontologist was, and Mom said that if he took a complete illustrated guide to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, shredded into 100 pieces, cast them into the wind from the museum steps, let a few weeks past, went back and scoured Fifth Avenue and Central Park for as many surviving scraps as he could find, then tried to reconstruct the history of painting, including schools, styles, genres, and names of painters from his scraps. That would be like being a paleontologist. The only difference is that paleontologists study fossils in order to figure out the origin and evolution of life. Every 14-year-old should know something about where she comes from, my mother said. It wouldn't do to go around without the faintest clue of how it all began. Then, very quickly, as if it weren't the point of everything, she said the book had belonged to Dad. Bird hurried over and touched the cover. It was called Life as We Don't Know It. On the back cover was a picture of Eldridge. He had dark eyes with thick lashes and a beard, and was holding up a fossil of a scary-looking fish. Underneath it said he was a professor of Columbia. That night I started to read it. I thought Dad might have written some notes in the margins, but he didn't. The only sign of him was his name on the inside cover. The book was about how Eldridge and some other scientists had gone down to the bottom of the ocean in a submersible and discovered hydrothermal vents at the places where tectonic plates met, which spewed mineral-rich gases reaching up to 700 degrees. Until that point, scientists thought the ocean floor was a wasteland with little to no life. But what Eldridge and his colleagues observed in the headlights of their submersible were hundreds of organisms never before seen by human eyes. A whole ecosystem that they realized was very, very old. They called it the dark biosphere. There were a lot of hydrothermal vents down there, and pretty soon they figured out that there were microorganisms living on the rock around the vents in temperatures hot enough to melt lead. When they brought some of the organisms to the surface, they smelled of rotten eggs. They realized that these strange organisms were subsisting on the hydrogen sulfide spewed from the vents and breathing out sulfur the way plants on land produce oxygen. According to Dr. Elridge's book, what they had found was no less than a window onto the chemical pathways that billions of years ago led to the dawn of evolution. The idea of evolution is so beautiful and sad. Since the earliest life on Earth, there have been somewhere between 5 and 50 billion species, only 5 to 50 million of which are alive today. So, 91% of all the species that have ever lived on Earth are extinct. 25. My brother, the Messiah. That night while I was reading, Bird came into my room and climbed into bed with me. At 11 and a half, he was small for his age. He pressed his little cold feet into my leg. "Tell me something about Dad," he whispered. "You forgot to cut your toenails," I said. He kneaded the balls of his feet and no idea if he liked to dance, but I said he loved it. He could even do the tango. He learned it in Buenos Aires. He and Mom danced all the time. He'd move the coffee table against the wall and use the whole room. He used to lift her and dip her and sing in her ear. Was I there? Sure you were, I said. He used to throw you up in the air and catch you. How do you know he wouldn't drop me? He just knew. What did he call me? Lots of things. Buddy, little guy, punch. I was making it up as I went. Bert looked unimpressed. Judah the Maccabee, I said. Plain Maccabee. Mac. What's the thing he called me the most? I guess it was Emmanuel. I pretended to think. No, wait. It was Manny. He used to call you Manny. Manny, Bert said, testing it out. He cuddled closer. I want to tell you a secret, he whispered, because it's your birthday. What? First, you have to promise to believe me. Okay. Say I promise. I promise. He took a deep breath. I think I might be a lame dvovnik. A what? One of the lame dvovniks, he whispered. The 36 holy people. What 36 holy people? The ones that the existence of the world depends on. Oh, those. Don't be. You promised. Bert said. I didn't say anything. There are always 36 at any time, he whispered. No one knows who they are. Only their prayers reach God's ear. That's what Mr. Goldstein says. And you think you might be one of them, I said. What else does Mr. Goldstein say? He says that when the Messiah comes, he's going to be one of the lame dvovniks. In every generation, there's one person who has the potential to be the Messiah. Maybe he lives up to it, or maybe he doesn't. Maybe the world is ready for him, or maybe it isn't. That's all. I lay in the dark trying to think of the right thing to say. My stomach began to hurt. 26. The situation verged on critical. The next Sunday, I put Life as We Don't Know It into my backpack and took the subway up to Columbia University. I wandered around the campus for 45 minutes until I found Eldridge's office in the Earth Sciences building. When I got there, the secretary eating takeout said Dr. Eldridge wasn't around. I said I would wait, and he said maybe I should come back another time since Dr. Eldridge wouldn't be in for a few hours. I told him I didn't mind. He went back to his food. While I waited, I read one issue of Fossil magazine. Then I asked the secretary, who was laughing out loud about something on his computer, if he thought Dr. Eldridge would come back soon. He stopped laughing and looked at me like I'd just ruined the most important moment of his life. I went back to my seat and read one issue of Paleontologist Today. I got hungry, so I went down the hall and got a package of devil dogs from a vending machine. Then I fell asleep. When I woke up, the secretary was gone. The door of Eldridge's office was open, and the lights were on. Inside, a very old man with white hair was standing next to a filing cabinet under a poster that said, Hence without parents. By spontaneous birth, rise the first specks of animated earth. Erasmus Darwin. Well, to be honest, I hadn't thought of that opinion, the old man said into the phone. I doubt he'd even want to apply. Anyway, I think we already have our man. I'll have to talk to the department. But let's just say things are looking good. He saw me standing at the door and made a gesture that he'd be off in a moment. I was about to say it was okay. I was waiting for Dr. Eldridge, but he turned his back and gazed out the window. Good, glad to hear it. I better run. Right then. All the best. Bye now. He turned to me. Terribly sorry, he said. What can I help you with? I scratched my arm and noticed the dirt under my fingernails. You're not Dr. Eldridge, are you? I asked. I am, he said. My heart sank. 30 years must have passed since the photograph on the book was taken. I didn't have to think for very long to know that he couldn't help me with the thing I had come about, because even if he deserved a Nobel for being the greatest living paleontologist, he also deserved one for being the oldest. I didn't know what to say. I read your book, I managed, and I'm thinking of becoming a paleontologist. He said, Well, don't sounds so disappointed. 27. One thing I am never going to do when I grow up is fall in love, drop out of college, learn to subsist on water and air, have a species named after me, and ruin my life. When I was little, my mother used to get a certain look in her eyes and say, "One day you're going to fall in love." I wanted to say, but never said, "Not in a million years." The only boy I'd ever kissed was Misha Slavsky. His cousin taught him in Russia, where he lived before he moved to Brooklyn, and he taught me. "Not so much tongue," was all he said. 28. 100 things can change your life. A letter is one. 5 months passed, and I'd almost given up on finding someone to make my mother happy. Then it happened. In the middle of last February, a letter arrived, typed on blue airmail paper and postmarked from Venice, forwarded to my mother from her publisher. Bert saw it first and brought it to Mom to ask if he could have the stamps. We were all in the kitchen. She opened it and read it standing up. Then she read it a second time, sitting down. "This is amazing," she said. "What?" I asked. "Someone wrote to me about the history of love. The book Dad and I named you after." She read the letter aloud to us. "Dear Miss Singer, I just finished your translation of the poem of Nicanor Para, who, as you say, wore on his lapel a little Russian astronaut and carried in his pockets the letters of a woman who left him for another. It's sitting here next to me on the table in my room in a pensionnat overlooking the Grand Canal. I don't know what to say about it except that it moved me in a way one hopes to be moved each time he begins a book. What I mean is, in some way I'd find almost impossible to describe, it changed me. But I won't go on about that. The truth is, I'm writing not to thank you, but to make what might seem like an odd request. In your introduction, you mentioned in passing a little-known writer, Zvi Litvinov, who escaped from Poland to Chile in 1941, and whose single published work, written in Spanish, is called The History of Love. My question is, would you consider translating it? It would be solely for my personal use. I don't have any intention of publishing it, and the rights would remain yours if you wished to do so yourself. I'd be willing to pay whatever you think is a fair price for the work. I always find these matters awkward. Could we say $100,000? There, if that strikes you as too little, please let me know. I'm imagining your response as you read this letter, which by then you will have spent a week or so sitting in this lagoon, then another month riding the chaos of the Italian mail system before finally crossing the Atlantic and being passed over to the U.S. Post Office, who will have transferred it into a sack to be pushed along in a cart by a mailman who will have slugged through rain or snow in order to slip it through your mail slot, where it will have dropped to the floor to wait for you to find it. And having imagined it, I've prepared for the worst, in which you take me for some sort of lunatic. But maybe it doesn't need to be that way. Maybe if I tell you that a very long time ago someone once read to me as I was falling asleep a few pages from a book called The History of Love, and that all these years later I haven't forgotten that night or those pages, you'd understand. I'd be grateful if you could send your response to me here, care of the above address. In case I'm already gone by the time it arrives, the concierge will forward my mail. Yours eagerly, Jacob Marcus. I thought, holy cow, I could hardly believe our luck, and considered writing back to Jacob Marcus myself with the excuse of explaining that it was Saint Exupery who'd established the last southern section of the mail route to South America in 1929, all the way to the tip of the continent. Jacob Marcus seemed interested in mail, and anyway, once my mother had pointed out that it was in part because of Saint X's courage was in the dirt with a stick. Her hair was being pulled, or she was pulling someone's hair, and a part of you was drawn to her, and a part of you resisted, wanting to ride off on your bicycle, kick a stone, remain uncomplicated. In the same breath, you felt the strength of a thought. Please don't look at me. If you don't, I can still turn away. And part of you thought, look at me. If you remember the first time you saw Alma, you also remember the last. She was shaking her head, or disappearing across a field, or through your window. Come back, Alma, you shouted. Come back, come back. But she didn't. And though you were grown up by then, you felt as lost as a child, and thought your pride was broken. You felt as vast as your love for her. She was gone, and all that was left was a space where you'd grown around her, like a tree that grows around a fence. For a long time, it remained hollow, years maybe. And when at last it was filled again, you knew that the new love you felt for a woman would have been impossible without Alma. If it weren't for her, there would never have been an empty space or the need to fill it. Of course, there are certain cases in which the boy in question refuses to stop shouting at the top of his lungs for Alma. Stages, a hunger strike, pleads, fills a book with his love, carries on until she has no choice to come back. Every time she tries to leave, knowing it's what has to be done, the boy stops her, begging like a fool, and so she always returns, no matter how often she leaves or how far she goes, appearing soundlessly behind him and covering his eyes with her hands, spoiling for him anyone who could ever come after her. 30. The Italian post takes so long, things get lost and lives are ruined forever. It must have taken another few weeks for my mother's reply to arrive in Venice, and by then Jacob Marcus had most likely gone, leaving instructions for his mail to be forwarded. In the beginning, I pictured him as very tall and thin with a chronic cough, speaking the few words of Italian he knew with a terrible accent, one of those sad people who are never at home anywhere. Bird imagined him as John Travolta in a Lamborghini with a suitcase of cash. If my mother imagined him at all, she didn't say. But his second letter came at the end of March, 6 weeks after his first, postmarked from New York and handwritten on the back of an old black and white postcard of a Zeppelin. My idea of him evolved. Instead of a cough, I gave him a cane he'd had since a car accident in his early 20s, and decided his sadness was because of his parents who'd left him alone too much as a child, then died, leaving him all of their money. On the back of the postcard, he wrote, Dear Miss Singer, I was overjoyed to receive your response and to hear that you'll be able to begin work on the translation. Please send the details of your bank account, and I'll wire the first $25,000 immediately. Would you agree to sending me the book in quarters as you translate it? I hope you'll forgive my impatience and attribute it to my anticipation and excitement about finally getting to read Litinoff's book and yours. Also to my fondness for receiving mail and to extending for as long as possible an experience that I expect to move me deeply. Yours truly, J.M. 31. Every Israelite holds the honor of his entire people in his hands. The money arrived a week later. To celebrate, my mother took us to a French movie with subtitles about two girls who run away from home. The theater was empty aside from 3 other people. One of them was the usher. Bird finished his milk duds during the opening credits and tore up and down the aisles in a sugar high until he fell asleep in the front row. Not long after that, during the first week of April, he climbed up onto the roof of Hebrew school, fell, and sprained his wrist. To console himself, he set up a card table around the house and painted a sign that said, Fresh lemonade, 50 cents, please pour yourself. Sprained wrist, in parentheses. Rain or shine, he was out there with his pitcher of lemonade and a shoebox for collecting money. When he'd exhausted the clientele on our street, he'd moved a few blocks away and set up a front of a vacant lot. He'd started to spend more and more time there. When business was slow, he'd abandon the card table and wander around, playing in the lot. Each time I passed, he'd done something to improve it. Dragged the rusted fencing off to one side, hacked down the weeds, filled a garbage bag with trash. When it got dark, he'd come home with his legs scratched, his kippah lopsided on his head. belongs to anyone who has a use for it, he told me. Thank you, Mr. Dalila. Vavnik, did Dr. Goldstein tell you that? No. Well, what's the big use you have for it? I called after him. Instead of answering, he walked to the door frame, reached up to touch something, kissed his hand, and went up the stairs. It was a plastic mezuzah. He stuck them onto every door frame in the house. There was even one on the door to the bathroom. The next day I found the 3rd volume of How to Survive in the Wild in Bert's room. He'd scrawled God's name in permanent marker across the top of every page. What did you do to my notebook? I shouted. He was silent. You ruined it. No, I didn't. I was careful. Careful! Careful! Who said you could even touch it? Ever heard the word private? Bert stared at the notebook in my hand. When are you going to start acting like a normal person? What's going on down there? Mom called from the top of the stairs. Nothing, we said together. After a minute, we heard her go back to her study. Bird put his arm over his face and picked his nose. Holy shit, Bird, I whispered through my teeth. At least try to be normal. You have to try. You have to at least try. 32. For 2 months, my mother hardly left the house. One afternoon, during the last week before summer vacation, I came home from school and found my mother in the kitchen, holding a package addressed to Jacob Marcus at an address in Connecticut. She'd finished translating the first quarter of the History of Love and wanted me to take it to the post office. Sure, I said, tucking it under my arm. Instead, I walked to the park and worked my thumbnail under the seal. On top was a letter, one sentence, written in my mother's tiny English handwriting. Dear Dr. Marcus, I hope these chapters are all you hoped for. Anything less is my fault entirely. Yours, Charlotte Singer. My heart sank. 15 boring words without even the slightest hint of romance. I knew I should send it, that it wasn't up to me, that it isn't fair to meddle in other people's business, but then, there are a lot of things that aren't fair. 33. The History of Love, Chapter 10. During the Age of Glass, everyone believed some part of him or her to be extremely fragile. For some, it was a hand, for others a femur, yet others believed it was their noses that were made of glass. The Age of Glass followed the Stone Age as an evolutionary corrective, introducing into human relations a new sense of fragility that fostered compassion. This period lasted a relatively short period in the history of love, about a century, until a doctor named Ignacio da Silva hit on the treatment of inviting people to recline on a couch and giving them a bracing smack on the body part in question, proving to them the truth. The anatomical illusion that had seemed so real slowly disappeared and, like so much we no longer need but can't give up, became vestigial. But from time to time, for reasons that can't always be understood, it surfaces again, suggesting that the Age of Glass, like the Age of Silence, never entirely ended. Take, for example, that man walking down the street. You wouldn't notice him necessarily, but he's not the sort of man one notices. Everything about his clothes and his demeanor ask not to be picked out from a crowd. Ordinarily, he would tell you this himself. He would be overlooked. He carries nothing. At least he appears to carry nothing. Not an umbrella, even though it looks like rain, or a briefcase, though it's rush hour. And around him, stooped against the wind, people are making their way home to their warm houses at the edge of the city, where their children lean over their homework at the kitchen table, the smell of dinner in the air, and probably a dog, because there is always a dog in such houses. One night, when this man was still young, he decided to go to a party. There, he ran into a girl he'd gone up through the grades with since elementary school, a girl he'd always been a little in love with, even though he was sure she didn't know he existed. She had the most beautiful name I'd ever heard, Alma. When she saw him standing by the door, her face lit up, and she crossed the room to talk to him. He couldn't believe it. An hour or two went by. It must have been a good conversation, because the next thing he knew, Alma had told him to close his eyes. Then she kissed him. Her kiss was a question he wanted to spend his whole life answering. He felt his body shaking. He was scared he was about to lose control of his muscles. For anyone else, it was one thing, but for him, it wasn't so easy, because this man believed, and had believed for as long as he could remember, that part of him was made of glass. He imagined a wrong move in which he fell and shattered in front of her. He pulled away, even though he didn't want to. He smiled at Alma's feet, hoping she'd understand. They talked for hours. That night, he went home full of joy. He couldn't sleep. So excited was he for the next day when he and Alma had a date to go to the movies. He picked her up the following evening and gave her a bunch of yellow daffodils. At the theater, he fought and triumphed over the perils of sitting. He watched the whole movie leaning forward so that his weight was resting on the underside of his thighs and not on the part of him that was made of glass. If Alma noticed, she didn't say. He moved his knee a little and a little more until it was resting against hers. He was sweating. When the movie was over, he had no idea what it had been about. He suggested they take a walk through the park. This time, it was he who stopped, took Alma in his arms, and kissed her. When his knees started to shake and he pictured himself lying in splinters of glass, he fought the urge to pull away. He ran his fingers down her spine over her thin blouse, and for a moment he forgot the danger he was in, grateful for the world which purposefully puts divisions in place so that we can overcome them, feeling the joy of getting closer, even if deep down we can never forget the sadness of our insurmountable differences. Before he knew it, he was shaking violently. He seized his muscles to try to stop. Alma felt his hesitation. She leaned back and looked at him with something like hurt, and then he almost but didn't say the two sentences he'd been meaning to say for years. Part of me is made of glass, and also, I love you. He saw Alma one last time. He had no idea it would be the last. He thought everything was just the beginning. He spent the afternoon making her a necklace of tiny birds out of folded paper strung together with thread. Right before he went out the door, he grabbed a needlepoint cushion from his mother's couch on an impulse and stuffed it into the seat of his pants as a protective measure. As soon as he did, he wondered why he hadn't thought of it before. That night, after he gave Alma the necklace, tying it gently around her neck, while she kissed him, feeling only a little tremor, nothing so terrible, as she ran her fingers down his spine and paused for a moment before slipping her hand into the seat of his pants, only to pull back as a look came over her that teetered between laughter and horror, a look that reminded him of a kind of pain he'd never not known. He told her the truth. At least he tried to tell the truth, but what came out was only half of the truth. Later, much later, he found that he was unable to relieve himself of two regrets. One, that when she leaned back, he saw in the lamplight that the necklace he made had scratched her throat. And two, that in the most important moment of his life, he had chosen the wrong sentence. For a long time, I sat there reading the chapters my mother had translated. When I finished the 10th, I knew what I had to do. 34. There was nothing left to lose. I crumpled my mother's letter and threw it in the trash. I ran home and went up to my bedroom to draft a calling him un vision, and one day a girl named Gracia Sturmer challenged me to go speak to him. And so Rosa did. She spoke to him for almost 3 hours that day as the afternoon lengthened, and the cool air came in off the water, and Littenoff, for his part, pleased with the attention of this young woman with a pale face and dark hair, delighted that she understood bits of Yiddish, suddenly filled with a longing he hadn't known he'd been carrying around inside of him for years, came to life, entertaining her with stories and quoting from poetry. That evening, Rosa went home filled with a giddy joy. Among the cocky, self-absorbed boys at the university, which their pomaded hair and empty talk of philosophy, and the melodramatic few who had professed their love to her at the sight of her naked body, there was not one with even half as much experience as Littenoff. The next afternoon, after her classes, Rosa hurried back to the cafe. Littenoff was there waiting for her, and again they talked excitedly for hours about the sound of the cello, silent films, and the memories they both associate with the smell of salt water. This went on for 2 weeks. They had a lot in common, but between them hung a dark and heavy difference that drew Rosa closer in an effort to grasp even the smallest bit of it. But Littenoff rarely talked about his past and all he'd lost, and not once did he mention the thing he'd begun to work on in the evenings at the old drafting table in the room where he lodged, the book that would become his masterpiece. All he had said was that he taught part-time in a Jewish school. It was hard for Rosa to imagine the man sitting across from her, dark as a crow in his coat, and touched with the solemnity of an old photograph, surrounded by a class of laughing, squirming children. It wasn't until 2 months later, Rosa writes, during the first moments of sadness, that seemed to slip in through the open window without her noticing, disturbing the rarefied atmosphere that comes with the beginning of love, that Littenoff read to me the first pages of the history. They were written in Yiddish. Later, with Rosa's help, Littenoff would translate them into Spanish. The original Yiddish manuscript, written in longhand, was lost when the Littenoff's house was flooded while they were away in the mountains. All that remains is a single page that Rosa rescued from where it was floating on the surface of the water that had reached the height of 2 feet in Littenoff's study. At the bottom, I caught sight of the gold cap of the pen he always carried in his pocket, she writes, and had to plunge my arm in up to the shoulder to reach it. The ink had run, but the name he had given her in this book, the name that belonged to every woman in the history, could still be made out in Littenoff's sloping handwriting at the bottom of the page. Unlike her husband, Rosa Littenoff wasn't a writer, and yet the introduction is guided along by a natural intelligence and shadowed throughout almost intuitively, with pauses, suggestions, ellipses, whose total effect is a kind of half-light in which the reader can project his or her own imagination. She describes the open window and how Littenoff's voice trembled with feeling as he read to her from the beginning, but says nothing about the room itself, which we are all left to assume must have been Littenoff's, with the drafting table that had once belonged to his landlady's son, and into the corner of which was carved the words of the most important of all Jewish prayers, so that every time Littenoff sat down to write at its sloped surface, he would consciously or unconsciously utter a prayer. Nothing of the narrow bed in which he slept, or the socks he'd washed and wrung out the night before, now draped like 2 exhausted animals over the back of a chair. Nothing of the single-framed photograph, turned at an angle so that it faced the peeling wallpaper, which Rosa must have looked at when Littenoff excused himself to go down the hall to the bathroom, of a boy and a girl standing with their arms hanging stiffly by their sides, hands clasped, knees bare, stalled in place, while out the window, seen in the far corner of the frame, the afternoon was slowly getting away from them. And though Rosa describes how with time she married her dark crow, how her father died, and the large house of her childhood, with its sweet-smelling gardens, was sold, and somehow they had money, how they bought a small white bungalow on the cliffs above the water outside Valparaiso, and Littenoff was able to give up his job at the school for a while and write most afternoons and evenings. She says nothing of Littenoff's persistent cough, which would often send him out onto the terrace in the middle of the night, where he'd stand gazing out at the black water. Nothing of his long silences, or the way his hands sometimes shook, or how she was watching him grow old before her eyes, as if time were passing more quickly for him than for everything personal notes and the single page of the Yiddish manuscript Rosa managed to salvage from the flood, there is only one known surviving letter, a postcard from 1964 addressed to a nephew in London. By then, the history had been published in a modest run of a couple of thousand copies, and Littenoff was teaching again, this time because of the bit of esteem gained from his recent publication, a course on literature at the university. The postcard can be viewed in a display case lined with worn blue velvet in the dusty museum of the city's history that is almost always closed when anybody thinks to visit it. On the back it says, simply, "Dear Boris, I was so happy to hear that you'd passed the exams. Your mother, may her memory be a blessing, would be so proud. A real doctor. You'll be busier now than ever. But if you want to visit, there is always the extra room. Stay for as long as you like. Rosa is a good cook. You could sit by the sea and turn it into a real vacation. How about girls? Just a question. You should never be too busy for that. Sending my love and congratulations. Svi." The front of the postcard, a hand-colored photo of the sea, is reproduced on the wall placard, along with the words, "Svi Littenoff, author of The History of Love, was born in Poland and lived in Valparaiso for 37 years, until his death in 1978. This postcard was written to his oldest sister's son, Boris Perlstein. In smaller letters, printed in the lower left corner, it says, "Gift of Rosa Litvinoff." What it does not say is that his sister, Miriam, was shot in the head by a Nazi officer in the Warsaw Ghetto, or that aside from Boris, who escaped on a kinder transport and lived out the remaining years of the war and his childhood in an orphanage in Surrey, and later, Boris's children, who were at times smothered by the desperation and fear that accompanied their father's love. Litvinoff had no surviving relatives. It also doesn't say that the postcard was never sent, but any observant viewer can see that the stamp isn't cancelled. What is not known about Svi Litvinoff is endless. It is not known, for example, that on his first and last trip to New York City in the fall of 1954, where Rosa insisted they go to show some editors his manuscript, he pretended to get lost from his wife in a crowded department store, wandered outside across the street, and stood blinking in the sunlight in Central Park. That while she searched for him along the displays of stockings and leather gloves, he was walking through an avenue of elm trees. That by the time Rosa found a manager and an announcement was made over the loudspeaker, "Mr. Litvinoff, calling Mr. Litvinoff, would you please meet your wife in ladies' footwear?" He had reached a pond and was watching as a boat rowed by a young couple floating towards the reeds behind which he was standing, and the girl, thinking she was hidden, unbuttoned her shirt to reveal two white breasts. At the sight of these breasts had filled Litvinoff with regret, and he hurried back through the park to the department store, where he found Rosa, her face flushed and her hair damp at the nape of her neck, talking to a pair of policemen. That when she threw her arms around him, telling him he'd scared her half to death and asked where on earth he'd been, Litvinoff answered that he had gone to the bathroom and gotten locked inside the stall. Then later, in a hotel bar, the Litvinoffs met the one editor who would agree to see them, a nervous man with a thin laugh and nicotine-stained fingers, who told them that though he liked the book very much, he could not publish it because no one would buy it. As a token of his appreciation, These things were lost to oblivion like so much about so many who are born and die without anyone ever taking the time to write it all down. That Litvinov had a wife who was so devoted is, to be frank, the only reason anyone knows anything about him at all. A few months after the book was published by a small publishing house in San Diego, Litvinov received a package in the mail. At the moment the postman rang the bell, Litvinov's pen had been poised above a blank piece of paper, his eyes watery with revelation, filled with the feeling that he was on the verge of understanding the essence of something. But when the bell rang, the thought was lost, and Litvinov, ordinary again, dragged his feet down the dark hallway and opened the door where the mailman stood in the sunlight. "Good day," the mailman said, handing him a large, neatly wrapped brown envelope, and Litvinov did not have to weigh the evidence for long to come to the conclusion that while a moment ago that day had verged on being excellent, more than he could have hoped for, it suddenly had changed like the direction of a squall on the horizon. This was farther confirmed when Litvinov opened the package and found the typeset of The History of Love, along with the following brief note from his publisher. "The enclosed dead matter is no longer needed by us and is being returned to you." Litvinov winced, not knowing it was accustomed to return the galley proofs to the author. He wondered if this would affect Rosa's opinion of the book. Not wanting to find out, he buried the note along with the matter, watching the embers sputter and curl in the fireplace. When his wife returned from her shopping, threw open the windows to let in the light and fresh air, and asked why he'd lit a fire on such a beautiful day, Litvinov shrugged and complained of a chill. Of the 2,000 original copies printed of The History of Love, some were bought and read, many were bought and not read, some were given as gifts, some sat fading in bookstore windows serving as landing docks for flies, some were marked up with pencil, and a good many were sent to the paper compactor, where they were shredded to a pulp along with other unread or unwanted books. Their sentences parsed and minced in the machine's spinning blades. Staring out the window, Litvinov imagined the 2,000 copies of The History of Love as a flock of 2,000 homing pigeons that could flap their wings and return to him, to report on how many tears shed, how many laughs, how many passages read aloud, how many cruel closings of the cover after reading barely a page, how many never opened at all. He couldn't have known it, but among the original run of The History of Love, there was a flare of interest following Litvinov's death, and the book was briefly returned to print with Rosa's introduction. At least one copy was destined to change a life, more than one life. This particular book was one of the last of the 2,000 to be printed, and sat for longer than the rest in a warehouse in the outskirts of Santiago, absorbing the humidity. From there, it was finally sent to a bookstore in Buenos Aires. The careless owner hardly noticed it, and for some years, it languished on the shelves, acquiring a pattern of mildew across the cover. It was a slim volume, and its position on the shelf wasn't exactly prime. Crowded on the left by an overweight biography of a minor actress, and on the right by the once best-selling novel of an author that everyone had since forgotten, it hardly left its spine visible to even the most rigorous browser. When the store changed owners, it fell victim to a massive clearance, and was trucked off to another warehouse, foul, dingy, crawling with daddy-long-legs, where it remained in the dark and damp before finally being sent to a small second-hand bookstore, not far from the home of the writer George Louis Borges. By then, Borges was completely blind and had no reason to visit the bookshop, because he could no longer read, and because over the course of his life he'd read so much, memorized such vast portions of Cervantes, Cheops, and Shakespeare, that all he had to do was sit in the darkness and reflect. Often visitors who loved the writer Borges would look up his address and knock on his door, but when they were shown in, they'd find the reader Borges, who would lay his fingers on the spines of his books until he located the one he wished to hear, and would hand it to the visitor, who had no choice but to sit and read it aloud to him. Occasionally he left Buenos Aires to travel with his friend Maria Kodama, dictating to her his thoughts on the felicity of a hot air balloon ride or the beauty of the tiger, but he did not visit the second-hand bookstore, even though while he could still see he had been on friendly terms with the owner. The owner took her time unpacking the books she'd bought cheaply and in bulk from the warehouse. One morning, going through the boxes, she discovered the mildewed copy of The History of Love. She'd never heard of it, but the title caught her eye. She put it aside, and during a slow hour in the shop, she read the opening chapter called The Age of Silence. The gestures were complex and subtle, involving a delicacy of motion that has since been lost completely. During the age of silence, people communicated more, not less. Basic survival demanded that the hands were almost never still, and so it was only during sleep, and sometimes not even then, that people were not saying something or other. No distinction was made between the gestures of language and the gestures of life. The labor of building a house, say, or preparing a meal was no less an expression than making the sign for I love you and I feel serious. When a hand was used to shield one's face when frightened by a loud noise, something was being said. And when fingers were used to pick up what someone else had dropped, something was being said. And even when the hands were at rest, that too was saying something. Naturally, there were misunderstandings. There were times when a finger might have been lifted to scratch a nose, and if casual eye contact was made with one's lover just then, the lover might accidentally take it to be the gesture, not at all dissimilar. For, now I realize I was wrong to love you. These mistakes were heartbreaking, and yet, because people knew how easily they could happen, because they didn't go around with the illusion that they understood perfectly the things other people said, they were used to interrupting each other to ask if they'd understood correctly. Sometimes these misunderstandings were even desirable, since they gave people a reason to say, "Forgive me, I was only scratching my nose. Of course I know I've always been right to love you." Because of the frequency of these mistakes, over time the gesture for asking forgiveness evolved into the simplest form. Just to open your palm was to say, "Forgive me." Aside from one exception, almost no record exists of this first language. The exception on which all knowledge of the subject is based is a collection of 79 fossil gestures, prints of human hands frozen in mid-sentence and housed in a small museum in Buenos Aires. One holds the gesture for sometimes when the rain, another for after all these years, another for was I wrong to love you. They were found in Morocco in 1903 by an Argentine doctor named Antonio Alberto di Biedma. He was hiking in the high Atlas Mountains when he discovered the cave where the 79 gestures were pressed into the shale. He studied them for years without getting any closer to understanding until one day, already suffering the fever of the dysentery that would kill him, he suddenly found himself able to decipher the meanings of the delicate motions of fists and fingers trapped in stone. Soon afterwards, he was taken to a hospital in Fez, and as he lay dying, his hands moved like birds, forming 1,000 gestures, dormant all those years. If at large gatherings or parties, or around people with whom you feel distant, your hands sometimes hang awkwardly at the ends of your arms, if you find yourself at a loss for what to do with them, overcome with sadness that comes when you recognize the foreignness of your own body, it's because your hands remember a time when the division between mind and body, brain and heart, what's inside and what's outside, was so much less. It's not that we've forgotten the language of gestures entirely. The habit of moving our hands while we speak is left over from it. Clapping, pointing, giving the thumbs up, all artifacts of ancient gestures. Holding hands, for example, is a way to remember how it feels to say nothing together. And at night, when it's too dark to see, we find it necessary to gesture on each other's bodies to make ourselves understood. The owner of the second-hand bookstore lowered the volume of the radio. She flipped it to the back flap of the book to find out more about the author, but all it said was that V. Litvinov had been born in Poland and moved to Chile in 1941, where he still lived today. There was no photograph. That day, in between helping customers, she finished the book. Before locking up the shop that evening, she placed it in the window, a little wistful about having to part with it. The next morning, the first rays of the rising sun fell across the cover of The History of Love. The first of many flies alighted on its jacket. Its mildewed pages began to dry out in the heat as the blue-gray Persian cat who lorded over the shop brushed past it to lay claim to a pool of sunlight. A few hours later, the first of many passerby gave it a cursory glance as they went by the window. The shop owner did not try to push the book on any of her customers. She knew that in the wrong hands such a book could easily be dismissed or, worst, go unread. Instead, she let it sit where it was in the hope that the right reader might discover it. And that's what happened. One afternoon, a tall young man saw the book in the window. He came into the shop, picked it up, read a few pages, and brought it to the register. When he spoke to the owner, she couldn't place his accent. She asked where he was from, curious about the person who was taking the book away. Israel, he told her, explaining that he'd recently finished his time in the army and was traveling around South America for a few months. The owner was about to put the book in a bag, but the young man said he didn't need one and slipped it into his backpack. The door chimes were still tinkling as she watched him disappear, his sandals slapping against the hot, bright street. That night, shirtless in his rented room, under a fan lazily pushing around the hot air, the young man opened the book and, in a flourish he had been fine-tuning for years, signed his name, David Singer. Filled with relentlessness and longing, he began to read. It looks like we're starting chapter 4, I'm pretty sure. They are numbered, so I don't know, but I'm pretty sure it's 4. It's called A Joy Forever. I don't know what I expected, but I expected something. My fingers shook whenever I went to unlock the mailbox. I went Monday, nothing. I went Tuesday and Wednesday. There was nothing on Thursday either. 2.5 weeks after I put my book in the mail, the telephone rang. I was sure it was my son. I'd been dozing in my chair. There was drool on my shoulder. I jumped to answer it. Hello? But it was only the teacher from the art class saying she was looking for people for a project she was doing at a gallery, and she thought of me because of my quote-unquote compelling presence. Naturally, I was flattered. At any other time, it would have been reason enough to splurge on spare ribs. And yet, what kind of project? I asked. She said all I had to do was sit naked on a meadow stool in the middle of the room, and then, if I felt like it, which she was hoping I would, dip my body into a vat of kosher cow's blood and roll on the large white sheets of paper provided. I may be a fool, but I'm not desperate. There's only so far I'm willing to go, so I thanked her very much for the offer, but said I was going to have to turn it down since I was already scheduled to sit on my thumb and rotate in accordance with the movements of the earth around the sun. She was disappointed, but she seemed to understand. She said if I wanted to come in and see the drawings the class had done of me, I could come to the show they were putting up in a month. I wrote down the date and hung up the phone. I'd been in the apartment all day. It was already getting dark, so I decided to go out for a walk. I'm an old man, but I can still get around. I hoofed it past Safi, Luncheonette, and the original Mr. Man Barber and Cossar's Baileys, where sometimes I'll go for a hot bagel on a Saturday night. They didn't used to make bagels. Why should they? If it's called Bailey's, then it's Bailey's. And yet, I kept walking. I went into the drugstore and knocked over a display of KY jelly, but my heart wasn't in it. When I passed the center, there was a big banner that said, "Doo-Doo Fisher this Sunday night, buy tickets now." Why not? I thought. I didn't go in for the stuff myself, but Bruno loves Doo-Doo Fisher. I went in and bought 2 tickets. I didn't have any destination in mind. It started to get dark, but I persevered. When I saw a Starbucks, I went in and bought a coffee. August, dead at 60. Isaac Moritz, acclaimed author of 6 novels including The Remedy, which won the National Book Award, died Tuesday night. The cause of death was Hodgkin's disease. He was 60. Mr. Moritz's novels are defined by their humor and compassion, and the hope they search for amid despair. From the first, he had his ardent supporters. These included Philip Roth, one of the judges for the National Book Award in 1972, awarded to Mr. Moritz for his first novel. At the center of The Remedy is a live human heart, fierce and imploring, Roth said in a press release announcing the prize. Another of Mr. Moritz's fans, Leon Witzler, speaking on the telephone this morning from the offices of the New Republic in Washington, D.C., called Mr. Moritz one of the most important and undervalued writers. To call him a Jewish writer, he added, or worse, an experimental writer, is to miss entirely the point of his humanity, which resisted all categorization. Mr. Moritz was born in 1940 in Brooklyn to immigrant parents. A quiet and serious child, he filled notebooks with detailed descriptions of scenes from his own life. One of those, an entry about watching a dog being beaten by a gang of children, written at the age of 12, later inspired the most famous scene in The Remedy, when the protagonist, Jacob, leaves the apartment of a woman to whom he has just made love for the first time, and, standing in the shadows of a street lamp in the freezing cold, watches a dog being brutally kicked to death by 2 men. At that moment, overcome with the tender brutality of physical existence, with the insoluble contradiction of being animals cursed with self-reflection and moral beings cursed with animal instincts, Jacob launches into a lament, a single, ecstatic paragraph, unbroken over 5 pages, that Time magazine called one of the most incandescent, haunting passages in contemporary literature. Aside from winning him an avalanche of praise in the National Book Award, The Remedy also made Mr. Moritz a household name. In its first year of publication, it sold 200,000 copies and was a New York Times bestseller. His sophomore attempt was awaiting with eager anticipation, but when Glass Houses, a book of stories, was finally published 5 years later, it was met with mixed reviews. While some critics saw it as a boldly innovative departure, others, such as Morton Levy, who wrote a scathing attack in commentary called The Collection of Failure. Mr. Moritz, wrote Levy, whose debut novel was emboldened by his eschatological speculations, has here shifted his focus to pure scatology. Written in a fragmented and at times surreal style, the stories in Glass Houses range in subject from angels to garbage collectors. Reinventing his voice yet again, Mr. Moritz's third book, Sing, was written in a stripped-down language described in the New York Times as taut as a drum, though in his more recent 2 novels he continued to search for new meanings of expressing them. Mr. Moritz's themes were consistent. At the root of his art was a passionate humanism and an unflinching exploration of man's relationship with his God. Mr. Moritz is survived by his brother, Bernard Moritz. I sat in a daze. I thought of my son's 5-year-old face. Also the time I watched him tie his shoe from across the street. Finally, a Starbucks employee with a ring in his eyebrow came up to me. "We're closing," he said. I looked around. It was true. Everyone was gone. A girl with painted nails was dragging a broom across the floor. I got up, or I tried to get up, but my legs buckled under me. The Starbucks employee looked at me as if I were a cockroach in the brownie mix. The paper cup I held was crushed into a damp pulp in my palm. I handed it to him and started to make my way across the floor. Then I remembered the newspaper. The employee had already thrown it into the trash bin he was rolling across the floor. I fished it out, smeared as it was with uneaten Danish, while he looked on. Because I am not a beggar, I handed him the tickets for Doo-Doo Fisher. I don't know how I got home. Bruno must have heard me unlock the door, because a minute later he came downstairs and knocked. I didn't answer. answer. I was sitting in the dark in the chair by the window. He kept knocking. Finally, I heard him go back upstairs. An hour or more passed, and then I heard him on the stairs again. He slid a piece of paper under the door. It said, "Life is beautiful." I pushed it back out. He pushed it back in. I pushed it back out. He pushed it in. Out, in, out, in. I stared at it. Life is beautiful. I thought, perhaps it is. Perhaps that is the word for life. I heard Bruno breathing on the other side of the door. I found a pencil. I scrawled, "And a joke forever." I pushed it back under the door and paused while he read it. Then, satisfied, he made his way back upstairs. "It's possible," I cried. "What's the difference?" I fell asleep near dawn. I dreamed I was standing in a railway station. The train came in and my father got off. He was wearing a camel hair coat. I ran to him. He didn't recognize me. I told him who I was. He shook his head no. He said, "I only had daughters." I dreamed my teeth crumbled, that my blanket suffocated me. I dreamed of my brothers. There was blood everywhere. I like to say, I dreamed that the girl I loved and I grew old together. I dreamed of a yellow door and an open field. I like to say, I dreamed that I died and my book was found among my things. And in the years that followed the end of my life, I became famous. And yet, I picked up the newspaper and cut out the photograph of my Isaac. It was wrinkled, but I smoothed it out. I put it in my wallet, in the plastic part made for a photo. I opened and closed the Velcro a few times to look at his face. Then I noticed underneath, where I cut it out, it said, "A memorial service will be." I couldn't read the rest. I had to take the photograph out and piece the two parts together. "A memorial service will be held Saturday, October 7th at 10 a.m. at Central Synagogue." It was Friday. I knew I shouldn't stay in, so I made myself go out. The air felt different in my lungs. The world no longer looked the same. You change and then you change again. You become a dog, a bird, a plant that leans always to the left. Only now that my son was gone did I realize how much I'd been living for him. When I woke up in the morning, it was because he existed. And when I ordered food, it was because he existed. And when I wrote my book, it was because he existed to read it. I took the bus uptown. I told myself I couldn't go to my own son's funeral in the wrinkled schmata I call his suit. I didn't want to embarrass him. More than that, I wanted to make him proud. I got off on Madison Avenue and walked along, looking in the windows. My handkerchief was cold and wet in my hand. I didn't know which store to go into. Finally, I just chose one that looked nice. I fingered the material on a jacket. A giant schwarfter in a shiny beige suit and cowboy boots approached me. I thought he was going to throw me out. "I'm just feeling the fabric," I said. "You want to try it on?" he asked. I was flattered. He asked me my size. I didn't know, but he seemed to understand. He looked me over, showed me into a dressing room, and hung the suit on the hook. I took my clothes off. There were 3 mirrors. I was exposed to parts of myself I hadn't seen in years. Despite my grief, I took a moment to examine them. Then I put on the suit. The pants were stiff and narrow, and the jacket practically came down to my knees. I looked like a clown. The schwarfter ripped aside the curtain with a smile. He straightened me out and buttoned me up and spun me around. We both looked into the mirror. "Fits you like a glove," he announced. "If you wanted," he said, pinching some material at the back, "we could take it in. A drop here, but you don't need it. Looks like it was made for you." I thought, what do I know from fashion? I asked him the price. He reached into the back of my pants and dug around in my tuchus. "This one's 1,000, he announced. I looked at him. 1,000? 1,000 what? I said. He laughed politely. We stood in front of the 3 mirrors. I folded and refolded my wet hanky. With a last shred of composure, I plucked my underwear from where it had lodged between my cheeks. There should be a word for this. The one-string harp. Out on the street, I kept times he tried to take a picture of me with the pinhole camera, and 3 times I failed to appear. My cousin couldn't understand it. He cursed the man who sold him the paper, thinking he'd been given a bad batch. But I knew he hadn't. I knew that the way others had lost a leg or an arm, I'd lost whatever the thing is that makes people indelible. I told my cousin to sit in the chair. He was reluctant, but finally he agreed. I took a photograph of him, and as we watched the paper in the developing pan, his face appeared. He laughed, and I laughed too. It was I who'd taken the picture, and if it was proof of his existence, it was also proof of my own. He let me keep it. Whenever I took it out of my wallet and looked at him, I knew I was really looking at me. I bought an album and fixed it to the second page. On the first page, I put the photo of my son. A few weeks later, I passed a drugstore with a photo booth. I went in. From then on, every time I had some spare money, I'd go to the booth. In the beginning, it was always the same, but I kept trying. Then one day, I accidentally moved. As the shutter clicked, a shadow appeared. The next time, I saw the outline of my face, and a few weeks later, my face itself. It was the opposite of disappearing. When I opened the door of the camera shop, a bell tinkled. 10 minutes later, I stood on the sidewalk clutching 4 identical photos of myself. I looked at them. You could call me plenty of things, but handsome isn't one of them. I tucked one in my wallet next to the picture of Isaac from the newspaper. The rest I threw in the trash. I looked up. Across the street was Bloomingdale's. I'd been there once or twice in my day to get a little spritz from one of the perfume ladies. What can I say? It's a free country. I rode the escalator up and down until I found the suit department on the lower level. This time I looked at the prices first. There was a dark blue suit hanging on the rack that was on sale for $200. It looked like it was my size. I took it to the dressing room and tried it on. The pants were too long, but that was to be expected. Same with the sleeves. I walked out of the cubicle. A tailor with a tape measure around his neck motioned me up onto the block. I stepped forward, and as I did, I remembered the time my mother sent me to the tailor to pick up my father's new shirts. I was 9, maybe 10. In the dim interior, the dummies stood together in the corner as if waiting for a train. Grodzinski, the tailor, was bent over his machine, his foot pedaling. I watched him, fascinated. Every day under his touch, with only the dummies as witness, drab bolts of cloth, grew collars, cuffs, ruffles, pockets. You want to try? He asked. I sat down in his seat. He showed me how to bring the machine to life. I watched the needle leap up and down, leaving behind it a miraculous path of blue stitches. no chance of my running into anyone. She was hooked to a life support, tubes up her nose, one foot in the other world. Whenever I looked away, I half expected that when I turned back she would be gone. She was tiny and wrinkled and deaf as a doorknob. There was so much I should have said, and yet I told her jokes. I was a regular Jackie Mason. Sometimes I thought I saw the hint of a smile. I tried to keep things light. I said, "Would you believe this thing here where your arm bends? This they call an elbow." I said, "Two rabbis diverged in a yellow wood." I said, "Mosh goes to the doctor. Doctor, he says, etc., etc." Many things I did not say. Example, I waited so long. Other example, and were you happy with that nebbish, that clod, that numbskull, schlemo you call a husband? The truth was I'd given up waiting long ago. The moment had passed, the door between our lives we could have led, and the lives we led had shut in our faces, or better to say, in my face. Grammar of my life, as a rule of thumb, wherever there appears a plural, correct for singular. Should I ever slip a royal we, put me out of my misery with a swift blow to the head? "Are you all right? You're looking a little pale." It was the man I'd seen earlier, the one in the yellow bow tie. When your pants are down around your ankles, that's when everyone arrives. Never a moment before when you might have been in a position to receive them. I tried to steady myself against the potted plant. Fine, I said. "And how did you know him?" he asked, giving me the once-over. I wedged my knee between the pot and the wall, hoping it would give me some balance. "Related. Family. So sorry, forgive me. I thought I'd meant all the Mishpokek." The way he pronounced it was Mishpoki. Of course, I should have guessed. He looked at me up and down, running a palm over his hair to make sure it was securely positioned. "I thought you were one of the fans," he said, gesturing towards the thinning crowd. "Which side, then?" I took hold of the thickest part of the plant. I tried to focus on the man's bow tie while the room around me swayed. "Both," I said. "Both," he repeated, incredulous, as he looked down at the roots struggling to keep their grip in the earth. I began. But with a sudden jerk, the plant came free. I lurched forward, only my leg was still wedged such that the unsupported leg was forced to spring forward alone, leaving the lip of the pot no place to go except jammed into my groin, and the hand no choice but to grind the clod of dirt dangling from the roots into the face of the man in the yellow bow tie. "Sorry," I said, pain shooting up my groin and electrocuting my kishkis. I tried to stand up straight. My mother, may her memory be a blessing, used to say, "Don't slump." Dirt rained from the man's nostrils. As a final touch, I pulled my cruddy hanky out and pressed it into his nose. He swatted my hand away and pulled out his own, freshly laundered and pressed into a neat square. He shook it loose, a flag of surrender. An awkward moment passed as he cleaned himself up and I nursed my nether region. Next thing I knew, I was standing face to face with my son's half-brother, my sleeve between the teeth of the pit bull in a bow tie. "Look what I rustled up," he barked. Bernard raised his eyebrows. "Says he's Mishpookie." Bernard smiled politely as he eyed first the rip in my collar, then the tear in my arm. "Forgive me," he said. "I don't remember you. Have we met?" The pit bull visibly salivated. A fine dusting of soil shifted in the crease of his shirt. I glanced at the sign marked "Exit." I might have made a run for it had I not been severely wounded in the privates. A wave of nausea came over me, and yet, sometimes you need a stroke of genius, and, lo and behold, genius comes and strokes you. "Diretz Yiddish," I whispered hoarsely. "Pardon?" I grabbed Bernard's sleeve. The dog had mine and I had Bernard's. I brought my face close to his. His eyes were bloodshot. He may have been an oaf, but he was a good man. And yet I had no choice. I raised my voice. "Diretz Yiddish." I could taste the stale alcohol saw him, I said. Saw him, he repeated. I nodded. He looked suddenly like a child whose mother has been late to pick him up, and only now that she'd arrived, allows himself to give in to tears. She used to tell us about it. Who's she? Demanded the dog. My mother. He comes from the same town as my mother, Bernard said. I've heard so many stories. I meant to pat his arm, but he moved to brush something from his eye. The result being that I ended up patting his band breast, not knowing what else to do. I gave it a squeeze. The river, right? Where she used to swim, Bernard said. The water was freezing. We would take our clothes off and dive off the bridge, screaming bloody murder. Our hearts would stop. Our bodies would turn to stone. For a moment we felt we were drowning. When we scrambled back onto the bank, gasping for air, our legs would be heavy, pain shooting up the ankles. Your mother was skinny, with small pale breasts. I would fall asleep drying in the sun, and wake to the shock of ice-cold water on my back, and her laughter. Did you know her father's shoe shop? Bernard asked. Every morning I picked her up there so we could walk together to school, except for the time we got in a fight and didn't talk for 3 weeks. Hardly a day passed that we didn't walk together. In the cold, her wet hair would freeze into icicles. I could go on and on, all the stories she told us. The field where she used to play. Yeah, I said, patting his hand. The field. 15 minutes later, I was sandwiched between the pit bull and a young woman in the back of a stretched limousine. You would think I was making a habit of it. We were going to Bernard's house for a small gathering of family and friends. I would have preferred to go to my son's house to mourn among his things, but I had to content myself with going to his half-brothers. Sitting in the seat opposite me in the limousine were 2 others. When one nodded and smiled in my direction, I nodded and smiled back. A relative of Isaac's, he asked. Apparently, the dog replied, groping for a lock of hair snapping in the draft from the window the woman had just lowered. It took almost an hour to get to Bernard's house, somewhere in Long Island. Beautiful trees. I'd never seen such beautiful trees. Out in the driveway, one of Bernard's nephews had split his band's legs to the knee and was running up and down in the sunlight, watching how they caught the breeze. Inside the house, people stood around a table piled with food talking about Isaac. I knew I didn't belong there. I felt like a fool and an imposter. I stood by the window, making myself invisible. I didn't think it would be so painful. And yet, to hear people talk about the son I'd only been able to imagine, as if he were as familiar to them as a relative, was almost too much to bear. So I slipped away. I wandered through the rooms of Isaac's half-brother's house. I thought, my son walked on this carpet. I came to a guest room. I thought, from time to time, he slept on this bed. This very bed. His head on these pillows. I lay down. I was tired. I couldn't help myself. The pillows sank under my cheek. And as he lay here, I thought, he looked out this very window, at that very tree. You're such a dreamer, Bruno says, and maybe I am. Maybe I was also dreaming this. In a moment, the doorbell would ring. I'd open my eyes, and Bruno would be standing there asking if I had a roll of toilet paper. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, Bernard was standing above me. Sorry, didn't realize anyone was in here. Are you sick? I sprang up. If the word spring can be used in a reference to my movements at all, this was the moment. And that's when I saw it. It was on a shelf right behind his shoulder. In a silver picture frame. I would say plain to see, but I've never understood that expression. What could be less plain than seeing? Bernard turned. Oh, that, he said, taking it down off the shelf. Let's see. This is my mother when she was a child. My mother, see. Did you know her then, the way she looked in this picture? Let's stand under a tree, she said. Why? Because it's nicer. Maybe you should sit on a chair and I'll stand above you, like they always do with husbands and wives. That's stupid. Why is it stupid? Because we're not married. Should we hold hands? We can't. But why? Because people will know. pencil on him. I doubt it, though. She never mentioned anyone. You can't understand a word I'm saying, can you? If I had a camera, I said, I'd take a picture of you every day. That way I'd remember how you looked every single day of your life. I look exactly the same. No, you don't. You're changing all the time. Every day a tiny bit. If I could, I'd keep a record of it all. If you're so smart, how did I change today? You got a fraction of a millimeter taller. For one thing, your hair grew a fraction of a millimeter longer. And your breasts grew a fraction of a... They did not. Yes, they did. Did not. Did too. What else, you big pig? You got a little happier and also a little sadder. Meaning they cancel each other out, leaving me exactly the same. Not at all. The fact that you got a little happier today doesn't change the fact that you also became a little sadder. Every day you become a little more of both, which means that right now, at this exact moment, you're the happiest and the saddest you've ever been in your whole life. How do you know? Think about it. Have you ever been happier than right now, lying here in the grass? I guess not. No. And have you ever been sadder? No. It isn't like that for everyone, you know. Some people, like your sister, just get happier and happier every day. And some people, like Bela Ash, just get sadder and sadder. And some people, like you, get both. What about you? Are you the happiest and saddest right now that you've ever been? Of course I am. Why? Because nothing makes me happier and nothing makes me sadder than you. My tears fell on the picture frame. Luckily, there was glass. I'd love to stay here reminiscing, Bernard said, but I really should go. All those people out there, he gestured. Let me know if you need anything. I nodded. He closed the door behind him, and then, God help me, I took the photograph and shoved it in my pants. Down the stairs I went and out the door. In the driveway, I knocked on the window of one of the limousines. The driver roused himself from sleep. Ready to go back now, I said. To my surprise, he got out, opened the door, and helped me in. When I got back to my apartment, I thought I'd been robbed. The furniture was overturned and the floor was dusted with white powder. Every surface was covered with pots and pans and dirty bowls. It seemed that whoever had broken in to rob me had taken time to make a meal. I stood with the photograph down my pants. There was a crash behind me and I turned and swung blindly. But it was just a pot that had slipped from the counter and rolled across the floor. On the kitchen table next to my typewriter was a large cake, sunk in the middle, standing nonetheless. It was frosted with yellow icing. And across the top in sloppy pink letters, it read, "Look who baked a cake." On the other side of my typewriter was a note. Waited all day. I couldn't help it. I smiled. I put the baseball bat away, upturned the furniture that I remembered I had knocked over the night before, took out the picture frame, breathed on the glass, rubbed it with my shirt, and set it up on my night table. I climbed the stairs to Bruno's floor. I was about to knock when I saw the note on the door. It said, "Do not disturb. Gift under your pillow." It had been a long time since anyone had given me a gift. A feeling of happiness nudged my heart. That I can wake up each morning and warm my hands on a cup of tea. That I can watch the pigeons fly. That at the end of my life, Bruno has not forgotten me. Back down the stairs I went. To delay the pleasure I knew was coming my way, I stopped to pick up my mail. I let myself back into my apartment. Bruno had managed to leave a dusting of flour over the entire floor of the place. Maybe a wind had blown in, who knows. In the bedroom, I saw that he had gotten down on the floor and made an angel in the flour. I stepped around it, not wanting to ruin what had been made so lovingly. I lifted my pillow. It was a large brown envelope. On the outside was my name, written in a handwriting I didn't recognize. I opened it. Inside was a stack of printed pages. I began to read. The words were familiar. For a moment, I couldn't place them. Then I realized they were my own. We're starting on the next chapter. It's called My Father's Tent. Looks like she's gonna be listing more things, too. Yep. Okay, so she's listing things about her father's tent. Number 1. My father did not like to write letters. The old Cadbury tin full of my mother's letters doesn't contain any of his replies. I've looked for them everywhere. was my 7th birthday. He was lying in a hospital bed wearing a hat because he had no hair. Shiny wrapping paper lay crumpled on his blanket. He held my hand and told me a story about when he was 6 and threw a rock at a kid's head who was bullying his brother, and how after that no one had ever bothered either of them again. You have to stick up for yourself, he told me. But it's bad to throw rocks, I said. I know, he said. You're smarter than me. You'll find something better than rocks. When the nurse came, I went to look out the window. The 59th Street Bridge shone in the dark. I counted the boats passing on the river. When I got bored, I went to look at the old man whose bed was on the other side of the curtain. He slept most of the time, and when he was awake, his hand shook. I showed him the pen. I told him that it could work without gravity, but he didn't understand. I tried to explain again, but he was still confused. Finally, I said, it's to use when I'm in outer space. He nodded and closed his eyes. Number 3. The man who couldn't escape gravity. Then my father died, and I put the pen away in a drawer. Years passed, and then I was 11 and got a Russian pen pal. It was arranged through our Hebrew school by the local chapter of Hadassah. At first, we were supposed to write to Russian Jews who had just immigrated to Israel, but when that fell through, we were assigned regular Russian Jews. On second, we sent our pen pals, Glass and Etrog, with our first letters. Mine was named Tatiana. She lived in St. Petersburg near the field of Mars. I liked to pretend she lived in outer space. Tatiana's English wasn't very good, and often I couldn't understand her letters, but I waited for them eagerly. Father is mathematician, she wrote. My father could survive in the wild, I wrote back. For every one of her letters, I wrote 2. Do you have a dog? How many people use your bathroom? Do you own anything that belonged to the Czar? One day a letter came. She wanted to know if I had ever been to Sears Roebuck. At the end there was a P.S. It said, boy in my class is moved to New York. Maybe you want to write him because he knows anybody. That was the last I ever heard from her. I searched out other forms of life. Where's Brighton Beach? I asked. In England, my mother said, searching the kitchen cabinets for something she'd misplaced. I mean the one in New York. Near Coney Island, I think. How far is Coney Island? Maybe half an hour. Driving or walking? You can take the subway. How many stops? I don't know. Why are you so interested in Brighton Beach? I have a friend there. His name is Misha and he's Russian. I said with admiration. Just Russian? My mother asked from inside the cabinet under the kitchen sink. What do you mean, just Russian? She stood up and turned to me. Nothing, she said, looking at me with the expression she sometimes gets when she's just thought of something amazingly fascinating. It's just that you, for example, are 1/4 Russian, 1/4 Hungarian, 1/4 Polish, and 1/4 German. I didn't say anything. She opened a drawer, then closed it. Actually, she said, you could say you're 3/4 Polish and 1/4 Hungarian, since Bub's parents were from Poland before they moved to Nuremberg, and Grandma Sasha's town was originally in Belarus, or White Russia, before it became part of Poland. She opened another cabinet stuffed with plastic bags and started rooting around in it. I turned to go. Now that I'm thinking about it, she said, I suppose you could also say you're 3/4 Polish and 1/4 Czech, because the town Zaid came from in Hungary before 1918, and in Czechoslovakia after, although the Hungarians continued to consider themselves Hungarian, and briefly even became Hungarian again during the Second World War. Of course, you could always just say you're half Polish, 1/4 Hungarian, and 1/4 English, since Grandpa Simon left Poland and moved to London when he was 9. She grabbed a piece of paper from the pad by the telephone and started to write vigorously. A minute passed while she scratched away at the page. Look, she said, pushing the paper over so I could see it. You can actually make 16 different pie charts, each of them accurate. I looked at the paper. It said, then again, you could always just stick with half English and half Israeli. Since I'm American, I shouted. My mother blinked. Suit yourself, she said, and went to put the kettle on to boil. From the corner of the room, where he was looking at the pictures in a magazine, Bird muttered, no, you're not. You're Jewish. Number 5. Once I used the pen to write to She was fascinating in her bathing suit, her skin wrinkled and puckered and covered with blue veins. We watched her face flush in the hot sulfur springs, beads of sweat forming on her upper lip. When she got out, water streamed off of her. We followed her down to the edge of the water. Bert stood in the mud, crossing his legs. "If you have to go, go in the water," Bub said in a loud voice. A group of heavy Russian women coated in the black mineral clay turned to look. If Bub noticed, she didn't care. We floated on our backs while she kept watch over us from under the wide brim of her hat. My eyes were closed, but I felt her shadow over me. "You don't have a bosom. What happened?" I felt my face get hot and pretended not to have heard. "You have boyfriends?" she asked. Bert perked up. "No," I muttered. "What?" "No. Why not? I'm 12. So what? When I was your age, I had 3, maybe 4. You're young and pretty." I don't know what this word is, so I'm not saying it. I paddled out to get some distance from her giant, imposing bosom. Her voice followed me. "But it won't last forever." I tried to stand and slipped in the clay. I scanned the flat water for my mother until I caught sight of her. She'd swum beyond the farthest bather and was still going. The next morning I stood at the wailing wall, still stinking of sulfur. The cracks between the massive stones were filled with tiny crumbling papers. The rabbi told me that if I wanted, I could write a note to God and add it to the cracks. I didn't believe in God, so I wrote to my father instead. "Dear Dad, I'm writing this with the pen you gave me. Yesterday Bert asked if you could do the Heimlich, and I told him yes. I also told him you could fly a hovercraft. By the way, I found your tent in the basement. I guess Mom didn't notice it when she threw out everything that belonged to you. It smells of mildew, but it doesn't have any leaks. Sometimes I set it up in the backyard and lie inside thinking about how you used to lie in it too. I'm writing this, but I know that you can't read it. Love, Alma." Bub wrote one too. When I tried to stuff mine into the wall, hers fell out. She was busy praying, so I picked it up and unfolded it. It said, "Baruch Hashem, I and my husband should live to see tomorrow, and that my Alma should grow up to be blessed with health and happiness. And what would be so terrible, some nice breasts." I'm gonna stop there for today. Thank you so much for watching. This is getting really good. I had a little bit of a hard time there for a minute because my grandpa died at the beginning of July, and weirdly enough, I didn't know it until he died, but he was my father figure. It's a long story. I picked a curly blood hair this video a like. That way I know you did enjoy it, and I can tell how many of you actually made it this far if you give it a like. Also, subscribe to my channel if you want to see the next video in this series and keep up with the storyline, because I'm not even halfway through this book yet, so there's going to be plenty more coming out in the future. I come out with these every 6 days too, so it's fun to follow along with and keep up with. And to make sure that you get notified, hit that notification bell and then go up. I know it's so annoying. Go up and click all notifications so that you get all notifications for my channel. But yeah, I really hope you guys are enjoying this. I absolutely love this book so much. I say that in every video now, I think. Let's just say I'm a huge believer in love, and this book really helps me remember that I guess I'm not the only one. Even though for so long I've felt like I am. It's so beautiful. I'm getting goosebumps. Okay. I don't know what words I'm saying. I'm not Jewish. I really hope those are defensive words. I'm so sorry if they are. Please don't hate me. I have no clue what that word is. Shvartzer. This is gonna be part number 17. By the way, I do have pink hair now. I'm not sure if you can even tell though in this lighting, but the last few episodes I was blonde. I have pink hair now. I think this is where I left off. I can't tell. I hope the AC doesn't mess with this recording. Also, this cat wants to keep scaring me by opening up this cabinet and closing it. Breathe. It's totally not daytime or anything, I promise. Actually, it is. I'm having trouble finding a good time at night to film, so I thought I would try this while my roommate is at work. Let's see how it goes. Also, I think I'm hearing a thunderstorm starting outside, which is wonderful. I love storms. Sorry if that bothers you, though. I'm gonna read you more of a bedtime story. I forgot to start with that, like always. This is more of the history of love. I think this is part 18, I'm pretty sure. I'm also in the process of trying to quit smoking cigarettes, so give me some applause, please. I've done pretty good today. Not other days, but today I've done good, okay? And I'm gonna try my hardest to keep doing good. Okay. If you have to go in the water, Bub said in a loud voice. That sounds like my grandma. Sorry if you hear my dog snoring. Whatever you are doing, have a good day, good night, good evening. Bye, guys. Whatever you're doing, have a good day, good night, good evening. Bye, guys. Whatever you are doing, have a good day, good night, good evening. Bye, guys. Whatever you are doing, have a good day, good night, good evening. Bye, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Whatever you are doing, have a good day, good night, good evening. Bye, guys. Whatever you are doing, have a good day, good night, good evening. Bye, guys. Whatever you're doing, have a good day, good night, good evening. Bye, guys. My channel is sponsored by a website called Wildflower Sex. For the rest of this ad read, I'm going to say sax, like saxophone, instead of the word that I need to say. So, let's talk more about Wildflower Sex. They are a sexual wellness company. First, I'll tell you about what I've purchased from there so far. Now, I will say I bought this without having any experience with said item. Plus tab, and there's tons of articles about gender, how-to guides, relationships, sex, body positivity, toys, tools, and my favorite I found, mental health. Super helpful. It's so wonderful to see an adult website that promotes saxophone wellness and education rather than just trying to throw stuff at you to buy constantly. Consider shopping around the site, and again, my affiliate link is in the description below, and if you can't spend money right now, I fully understand. Check out the website anyway and read the articles they have to offer, because it's never too late to learn new things. Purchase anything through my link, then I will get part of that commission, so you would be supporting me. It would be great. By the way, I have other links if you want to check those out. They will be in my link trick below as well. I also have a parasol umbrella. The reviews were iffy. Also, I don't believe in a lot of superstitions. If you believe in superstitions, you can't live. Oh. So occasionally. So it looks like I just proved my whole point wrong, because it looks like my whole umbrella broke. But this happens occasionally if I don't put it away right. All of these need to be lined up with the ends correctly, and if they're not, this will happen. So I promise it's not broken, even though it looks like it.
Oh my gosh.
I've had a lot of practice.